Hello everyone, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Eva Bernhard-Kempers and I'm a Junior Research Associate at the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. For those of you who are attending the Talking Animals series for the first time, just a quick note on the format. So we'll start with around 45 minutes of presentation, and after that we'll have another about 40 minutes for a Q&A and discussion. The event will end at 5:30 p.m. UK time. So you're all warmly invited to participate in the discussion. In case you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can either signal this in the chat or you can use the raise hand function. I will then go through the chat or the raised hands in the discussion section, and I will allow you to directly ask your question to our speaker. Until that point, I will keep all attendees' microphones muted. So we will be recording the presentation part of this event and later be uploading the video to our website. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Dr. Samiparna Samanta. Samiparna Samanta is a historian by training and a professor of history at Jindal Global Law School in India. She studied history of science and medicine at Florida State University, where she also received her master's and PhD. Her first book, Meat, Mercy, Morality, published by Oxford University Press, uses human attitudes towards non-human animals as a lens to understand the complexities of British imperialism in Bengal. She's currently working on a book project that investigates the lives of human cadavers to write a history of the anatomical and spectral body in colonial India. Okay, Samiparna, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Eva, for that introduction. Just wanted to make sure I'm going to share my PowerPoint, right? So should I pull it up or? Yes, just in a minute. All right. Okay, so yeah, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Okay, good. All right. All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my scholarship, and I'm very delighted to be here to talk about my book and slaughterhouses today in particular. So, as Eva mentioned, I'm a historian by training, and I focus predominantly on late 19th and early 20th century India, particularly Bengal. So this talk today, Meat, Murrain, Modernity, it's part of my monograph, Meat, Mercy, Morality, that really, that demonstrates how colonial legislations and preoccupations with animals can be used as a sort of a window to study a colonial society. And that sort of opened up hidden anxieties about race, class, caste, and science. So before I move on, I just wanted to give you a sense of how my talk is going to be structured. So I want to state my arguments at the very beginning, at the very outset, and then I'm going to take you through the story. I'm just going to, take you through the colonial city of Calcutta and the history of its slaughterhouses. And I'm going to, as it unfolded, and I'm going to wrap up by sort of situating my, the theoretical contribution to the field of history of animals, non-humans. And then, as Eva mentioned, I'm very happy to take questions at the end. So, yes, here we go. So, like several other British colonies, in British India, there was a very strong preoccupation with plants and animals, which played very significant role in the making of the Indian colony. Animals, in particular, were used as labor, as energy for transport, and as food sources, right? But despite the socioeconomic importance of domesticated animals, South Asian scholarship has been relatively silent on examining animals as until very recently. Although there is quite a surge in studies on animals in empire across the world. So here are some works that I just quickly wanted to, outline or lay out so that I could then, talk about where I come in and, the kind of work that or the scholarship that I bring into this field. So Mahesh Rangarajan and others look at shikar, or really, the idea of hunting, and how hunting changes with the arrival of the British. The character or nature of hunting in India changes with colonialism. One of my personal favorites is Alan Mikhail, who has worked extensively on the Ottoman empires, and he has sort of demonstrated how non-humans deepened the foundations of empires, which he characterizes them as anthrozoological states. I'm also very fond of Jonathan Saha's work, who's sort of looked at colonial sensibilities in the context of Burma. And he talks about a certain kind of ambivalence that characterized colonial attitudes towards animals. So, in the context of South Asia, however, it's often been argued that animals are doubly marginalized. Both within South Asian studies that continue to be anthropomorphic, and also within the field of animal studies that is largely that remain focused on histories of North America and Europe. So my scholarship, the book, and here in today's talk also is sort of a attempt to fill in that gap in South Asian scholarship by co-opting non-humans or animals into the study of empire building. So in this talk today, I'm going to use one such example, the story of Calcutta slaughterhouses, to show how it became a site of contestation over diet, over nutrition, over human health, public hygiene, and science in colonial India. And also, more importantly, I think, what this history of Calcutta slaughterhouses really bring to the story of colonialism. So I'm going to start with the more recent news, and then I'm going to tie this to 19th century Bengal. so so about 10 years back, roughly 10 years back, in March 2015, at a sprawling slaughterhouse in the suburbs of Mumbai, almost 2,000 butchers and cattle traders just suddenly, unexpectedly lost their jobs. And very soon, across the entire state of Maharashtra, some 1 million cattle traders, they faced a similar fate as a beef ban threatened their livelihoods. Now, the Indian government's experiments with food choices of humans continued for the next few years. And within the next couple of years, by 2017, I think the central government had extended its ban, beef ban, to other states of India, including Kerala and Assam, that are actually pretty heavily reliant on beef. So the beef ban and the cattle slaughter bills evoked immediate reaction, and and all of a sudden, India's cows hit the headlines of international news space and social media as the world's largest democracy debated whether to eat meat or not. According to the BBC, the ban generated one of the world's top, trending hashtags. So steaks disappeared overnight from the restaurants, much to the annoyance of Bombay's very, cosmopolitan elites. We see violence erupting at college canteens because meat politics divided the students. And many Hindu nationalists welcomed the ban because it meant that Indians would now stop devouring the goddess, because cow is considered to be Gomata, goddess and mother. And others sort of shuddered at the growing intolerance in a secular country like India, because eating beef actually constitutes a very integral part of Adivasi and which is tribal and Dalit cultures and identity. So tensions continued and escalated, and eventually this gentleman, the photograph, the image that I have here on the slide, a 50-year-old Muslim gentleman, Muhammad Akhlaq, was lynched by a Hindu mob in the village of Dadri, which is actually pretty close to where I am. It's just slightly more than an hour's drive from Delhi. So this happened in September 2015 on suspected charges of beef eating. The meat was then sent to the forensics team to determine whether it was beef or mutton. So as I mentioned, by 2017, this sort of thin, suspicious line separating beef and mutton had led to the death of several Muslims in, different parts of the country. So the ban brutally polarized an already divided nation as the world's attention now sort of focused on India's bovine creatures. So, is this dilemma on whether to eat meat or not just a contemporary paradox that is seething in a Hindu nationalist regime, or can the tension be traced back to India's colonial past? So, in this talk, I argued that the irony that haunts India's meat industry is not entirely new, although the language of the discourse has changed over time, with changing contexts and with emerging new knowledge systems. In fact, and I'm going to show this today, that similar debates surrounding meat eating had raged voraciously in the late 19th century and early 20th century as a twin sentiment of compassion for an animal and killing the same animal had reached a record high in colonial India. So it is in that context that I explore specifically how the slaughterhouses emerge as this, a site of fervent tension among veterinarians, public health officials, animal right protectionists, and and the Hindu Bengali middle class, or the Bhadralok, as they all debated the regulation of the city's urban space and who rightfully belonged in it, Hindus, Muslims, or the white civilians. So I'm just going to very quickly take you through a map. Yeah, here. So the geographic region that we are looking at today is Bengal, which is in the eastern part of India. And the time frame, as I mentioned, is late 19th to early 20th century. So by the early 19th century, Calcutta was a classic colonial city. It was a river port that was close to a harbor, and it's a center of colonial political power, and it had a mixed population. So throughout the 19th century, we notice an expansion in the population of Calcutta. And it's this rapidly growing population that left its mark also on the dietary habits of both, the Bengalis and the British. It generated a great demand for meat. Now, the British of the early 19th century were renowned for their extravagant consumption of meat, which cost very little actually in India. The British in Calcutta were known to eat, all sorts of meat and poultry, curried and roasted. Now, some scholars like Elizabeth Collingham has sort of demonstrated how diet became the sort of a marker of, your cultural characteristic. It's a cultural site on which a sense of bodily difference between the British and their Indian subjects was maintained. So, thanks to this lavish consumption of meat, stomach disorders were inevitably common, but everyone blamed the climate rather than, the unsuitability of their diet. And this is a familiar story for many of us that work on empires, that, this is when the environmentalist paradigm is really dominating. So almost every diary or private memoir or letters that you see from this period, they sort of record complaints about the stomach disorders, and the Indian climate is blamed. So, as you know, India, along with sub-Saharan Africa, are considered to be the white man's grave, and Calcutta, is hot, humid, and inhospitable. So let's take a look at a few examples. As I have here. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there we go. So, for instance, the governor of Bengal, Philip Francis, writes, "I'm tormented with the bile and obliged to live on mutton chop and water. The devil is in the climate, I think." And to give you a sense of, what or how much, they would eat, here you have an excerpt from a memoir of a British official in Calcutta. This is also 1800s, where he describes the chota haziri, or the little breakfast. And as you can see, a lot of meat, right? And yeah. So it's sort of a direct import of Victorian eating habits here in India. So what we see that is that the British are on a lavish meat diet to mark themselves as distinct from the repulsive Indians, and meat really served as a metaphor for a physically superior Raj, right, like a more masculine Raj. Now let's take a look at the Bengalis. So in Bengal, while the British glorified themselves as being more masculine and manly, the Bengali man or the Bengali babu was often, stereotyped to be effeminate. So some historians like Mrinalini Sinha has actually demonstrated how this trope of effeminacy was, against the Bengalis. Bengali man was invented, constructed, let's say, by the British to sort of justify the domination, right, over unmanly Indians. So from late 19th century, roughly from 1880s onwards, when there's a sort of boom in vernacular press, the sprint capitalism, among the rice-eating babus, among the rice-eating Bengali men, perhaps as a sort of response, as a reply to Western charges of emasculation, there was a proliferation of medical journals that emphasized the Bengali need for consuming animal protein. So these are some of the journals that I've looked at. Shastu Samachar, Shastu is health, and Samachar is magazine or periodical. So literally, these are health periodicals that that emphasize the need for consuming meat. And by meat here, I largely mean mutton, as in and buffalo also. Yeah. So So, in terms of the economics of meat consumption, we do not know if this propaganda for increased meat consumption immediately boosted the demands for meat. But indeed, from the 1850s and 60s onward, archival evidence show that a large number of animals, cattle, were indeed brought from the different districts of Bengal, like Burdwan, Nadia, and all of these, to the metropolis, to Calcutta, for being slaughtered. And the slaughter of an increasing number of cattle to provide meat for the people of Calcutta and also the British Indian troops that were stationed in Fort William diminished the supply of cattle for agricultural uses and tended to raise its price. So, interestingly, the cattle traders of a certain market called Ultudanga Market, which is again in Calcutta, complained to the Cattle Plague Commission in 1860s that cattle have become rare. The butchers are buying up all the cattle of the country. So, increasing demand for meat meant that innumerable unlicensed slaughterhouses now came up in, all over Calcutta and places like Chitpur and Narkuldanga, which exist even today, catering to the meat requirements of the urban population. And with increasing urbanization, the need for public hygiene became a pressing imperative. So we have sanitary commissioners that came up all over the city, and the entire discourse of cleanliness was very soon sort of divided along the lines of White Town and Black Town. So, the European hygienic enclaves, which were largely the white towns, had to be guarded from the black towns, which were the swampy and sanitary places where the natives lived. So, however, I think it's important for us to remember that by the early 19th century, the spatial segregation of the city seemed no longer to hold weight. Because if the air of the city is, poison, and I'm talking about miasma theory, the idea that air is poison, then no one is exempt from disease. And in this new climactic paradigm, concern for slaughterhouses emerged as an agenda of sanitation and public health. So by the 1864, by 1864, the sanitary commissioner for Bengal complained that it's a disgrace that a city like Calcutta should have no decent public slaughterhouses, that Calcutta was a scandal, and I'm quoting him, scandal and disgrace to civilized government. Now, the demand for a proper slaughterhouse also came from another quarter that was becoming increasingly vocal in demanding better treatment of animals. The CSPCA, or the Calcutta Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was founded roughly 20 years after the foundation of the RSPCA in London. And in many ways, if you look at the objectives and what it sought to do of the CSPCA, in many ways it sought to mirror those of RSPCA in London. an elite humane society, and its patrons were propertied Hindu zamindars and Muslim, landlords and property magnates. And collectively, they sought to reform Calcutta's slaughterhouses. So at this point, if I pull the two stories together, what we have is cattle being brought to the slaughterhouses that are springing up in increasing numbers, and a sentiment of compassion towards animals that find institutional legitimacy. So I think at this point, it's sort of useful to study the slaughterhouse as a historical site where these diverse forces converge and clash. So, if we take a closer look at the slaughterhouse, we notice that a multitude of concerns came flooding in. So, this is the composition of the CSPCA. I mean, yeah, I missed showing this slide. That yeah, the demographics show that you have a missionary influence and largely influenced by the London Vegetarian Society. But that's something I could happy to take up during the Q&A. So so going back to the slaughterhouse, what we see that is that the CSPCA now pleaded for the intervention of the lieutenant governor in the slaughter practices, which, as you can see, were repugnant to humanity. It went against, Christian spirits of kindness. And as for the British doctors, it was really the method of slaughter that, that attracted their attention. The British doctors in Calcutta commented on the effects of halal, that halal epitomized Mohammedan barbarity, that it was a symbol of Oriental backwardness. Joseph Ewart, for instance, the presidency surgeon of Calcutta, argued that the English practice of instant death, due to destruction of consciousness by means of a pole axe, which will be followed by immediate bleeding, is a perfectly painless method of dying, and that's the way to go because it preserves the purity of the meat. So the discourse now sort of focused on the feasibility of civilized European slaughter practices versus halal, which sort of interestingly to me, also mimicked and informed the larger divide between the colonized and the colonizer. And herein, I feel that slaughterhouses, also became a site for regulating filth and pollution and determining the boundaries between what is clean and unclean. So finally, the first Slaughterhouse Act was passed in 1865, by which one large public slaughterhouse was built at a place called Tangra, which again exists in Calcutta even today. The act declared that all butchers henceforth should use the Tangra slaughterhouse. They ought to get a license, and a ticket to be able to use it. So after much fanfare, the slaughterhouse was opened in 1869, but we see that unlicensed slaughterhouses continued to operate in full swing. So if these legislations and colonial sensibilities about halal and oriental filth and miasma sort of acted upon the physical space of the city, what about the Bengali literati? What about the Bengali middle class? What did they have to say about slaughterhouses? So in order to understand that, we need to just very quickly go back to that emphasis on meat eating that I had discussed just a few minutes back. And I just wanted to make a quick disclaimer that I'm using the word Bhadralok, implying middle class, very loosely to indicate the educated Bengali middle class. But in reality, it's a very complex group. They were marked by huge diversity in terms of their cultural values and intellectual values and economic positions. So I'm using the word slightly loosely to imply the Bengali middle income group that is English speaking. They spoke English, and which is overwhelmingly upper caste, upper class, and male, Hindu, upper caste, upper class, male, English speaking. So if the Bengali Bhadralok discourse on meat eating in the mid-19th century stemmed from a desire to counter charges of emasculation, the discourse, however, has shifted by the beginning of the next century. It now only gets messier. Now, a compelling force in favor of vegetarianism in India has always been the ethical one, the religious one. The notion of ahimsa or non-violence has a long history in the country. Upper caste Hindus and Vaishnavas do not eat meats and beef, and so such perceptions, Buddhist, Jain, Vaishnav, have a long history in the country, and therefore, the propaganda for championing vegetarianism should not really surprise us. What is surprising is, however, the sharp shift in the Bengali discourse from an emphasis on meat eating to vegetarianism within a very short span of few years. Writings advocating meat eating disappeared completely by the turn of the 20th century. Vegetarianism was now the new mantra. It was seen as a reliever, as a remedy, as a reliever of all sorts of diseases. So, from the early 20th century onward, the champions of vegetarianism were no longer defending a vegetarian diet from purely ethical or religious grounds. Rather, the focus had shifted to towards a practical need for detecting unwholesome meat. Meat was subtly considered to be responsible for all sorts of diseases, and to talk about a lot of diseases, particularly skin disorders and tuberculosis, and the numerous scientific hygienic claims are now put forward in pamphlets, and I have a few of these listed on the slide, and lectures and tracts that sort of reflects the Bengali middle class paranoia. So, for instance, in 1916, this author in this Bengali periodical called Bangobashi, which I have here listed, is so anxious that Calcutta is suddenly flooded with British-style hotels, and he raises alarm that no one knows what meat they serve, how fresh it is. They might just season it with chilies and onions and garlic and cover up the staleness. So the slaughterhouse inspection came to assume a significant space in their fears. And the Bhadralok fears of a meat diet also manifested very powerfully in another essay, which is again 1916, where I find this very interesting that the author cites examples of New York, Brooklyn yards, to argue that when medical scientists in New York are campaigning for vegetarianism, then why are we Indians so influenced by British habits and eating whatever it is that they serve in this British styled hotels? So, I mean, it's really tempting to sort of wonder if the Bengali, this middle class and doctors that are demanding tighter inspection of slaughterhouses are and advocating vegetarianism were indeed influenced by Sinclair's Jungle that was published in 1906. I tried to find direct evidence, but I couldn't. So all these, anxieties and paranoia that we see sort of force us to raise this critical question, which is what caused this sudden shift towards vegetarianism, and also what does this bring to the story of colonialism? So I argue that the vegetarian propaganda of late 19th and early 20th century was not mediated by genuine concerns for animal welfare, although I'm not saying that there is a direct correlation. But instead, I draw attention to one particular development that we see in late 19th century Bengal, and that sort of created panic among the middle class as well as the colonial establishment. And that is, let me go to the next slide here. Rinderpest or cattle plague that began to affect Bengal from I would say mid 19th is what my records show, from 1850s onward. But it reached disastrous levels by the end of the century, and the spread of the disease was, as also the impact on trade and agriculture was absolutely alarming. Most devastating were the mortality rates. The disease could wipe out a herd of cattle just within a week's time. So rinderpest really reintroduced diseased meat into the discourse, and although there is little quantitative evidence to suggest how much meat was being sold, but there are reasons to believe that sick animals regularly proliferated the market, because I feel the farmers would find it more profitable to just sell the diseased animal rather than seek veterinary care, and veterinary science is very unreformed at this stage. So whenever they would show the first signs of a disease, that's when they just sell it. So I'm just going to gradually wrap it up. So historians have tried to examine how this debate on nutrition was a multi-layered one. The issue of vegetarianism versus non-vegetarianism was a cultural question. It could be a nationalist question. Utsa, for instance, her book came out from Cambridge University, and she talks about pure food, and she talks about how pure food is something that's uncontaminated by the lower caste. So what I do is that in my study, I study the scientific language of it. I argue that the discourse is also scientific, and that's what I try to discuss that in this new climate, even ethical reasons for or against meat eating were often explained away in more scientific terms when the doctors sort of envision a really correlation between meat eating and public health. So the medical knowledge over animal disease is still very fuzzy, but nonetheless, the question of whether or not to eat meat is no longer a matter of ethics or ahimsa or religion or cruelty, but it's increasingly tied to the use of the word sanitary science, and I'm quoting them, the official records, and also gradually as we move more to the 20th century. Nutrition science, which becomes the single most important category. So even within the new discourse, we notice this strange sort of, ambivalence within the Bengali middle class in their negotiation with the West, which I really try to problematize, and which is what I think makes the entire debate so much complex and also richer. And I just wanted to draw upon this intriguing essay published in 1899 by this gentleman, Rabindra Sundar Trivedi, who was a physics professor at a college in Calcutta. And no one really epitomizes the tension, the sort of the ambivalence in their, worldview at the diet than Trivedi, because he notes with pride that ahimsa, non-injury to living beings, originated in India and not really in the Christian lands of Europe. But he's also deeply aware of an inbuilt Vedic in, let's say, ambivalence in Vedic and Brahminical animal sacrifices, that it's also violent, right? If you look at the Vedic religion, it's huge, narratives of animal sacrifices. So Trivedi eventually sort of seeks refuge in the claims of science, and he concludes that he hopes one day humans, with the aid of science, will be kind enough, strong enough not to eat meat anymore. So I feel that cruelty, non-violence, and science sort of fascinatingly enmeshed in his optimism as he waits for the day when science would conquer ahimsa. So, what is this science that Trivedi talks about? Is it a science that grows in a colonial milieu? So, indeed, this very question, what is colonial about colonial medicine, has engaged scholars for over a decade. And it's a complex question, and I do not pretend to provide an easy answer in the next few minutes that we are here. But I think it's a larger question that's worth investigating and thinking about, as to whether Western medicine achieved complete hegemony over South Asian society. And so my research in the context of nutrition science sort of tends to challenge these binaries of resistance and appropriation, to ask that what if there's both happening simultaneously in the worlds of the Bengalis, that it could be a sort of a dialogue instead of a polarized, a binary. And indeed, that's what I argue in following my findings, that the Bengali middle class mediated language of science in their understanding of meat inspection and food adulteration. They really defended the knowledge systems like the Hindu Shastras and the Upanishads and the Vedas, and did not believe that the tradition is unscientific or irrational. However, they did not also, they also strongly believe that there's nothing wrong in sort of, learning from new knowledge arriving from the West. And it's this interesting moment of borrowing that I've tried to really, problematize, because as a prominent historian of science, Projit Mukherjee, discusses in his book, that there is such an overwhelming tendency to sort of look at Western medicine as a necessarily, repressive power in colonial and post-colonial societies, that we often tend to ignore its productive moments, productive role in constituting new sort of subject positions. And so in my research, I've sort of tried to shift gears to really look at these productive moments of encounter and demonstrate in this entire story that I just narrated so far, that in the course of this meandering trajectory, there were moments when the West spoke hegemonically to the East. For instance, the CSPCA as a very sort of a colonial body repudiating halal as Mohammedan barbarity, or even the mere naming the disease as rinderpest and subverting all sorts of native understandings of animal disease. But at the same time, the middle class, Bengali middle class, also translated Western notions of science in their worlds, and they're not passive recipients in their path. And so I'm just going to gradually conclude that. So if you go back to the story in the, to the 20th century, examination of meat gradually became a regular feature of local, public health work. Sanitary inspectors were appointed starting, I think, 1897. A veterinary inspector was appointed in 1906, but meat inspection still remained very chaotic because the middle class did not have as much political power to impact any changes. And by 1920, a civil veterinary department was formed, which is where my story ends, because then things change and it's more structured and the messiness sort of disappears. So, so yeah, and finally, just to sort of conclude, as we have just seen, this discourse surrounding animal cruelty and nutrition and slaughterhouses was ever shifting, and it carried within it multiple strands as different parties participated in the debate at distinct historical moments. In the early 19th century, private slaughterhouses represented sort of a nuisance, that had to be cleansed, and a source of cruelty, halal, that had to be repressed. So therefore, the official concerns revolved around the physical space of the city, right? The debates were about like where should we establish the slaughterhouse, within the city, outside the city, right? And should we follow the example of Paris? But by the early 20th century, the emergence of rinderpest as a sort of as a zoonotic disease had led to a change in the entire language of the discourse. And although the humanitarian and anti-cruelty dimension remained important, I think a language of diseased meat control began to take over attempts, especially with the popularization of germ theory in 1872. That if the air, if the air is not poisonous, then it's germs that cause disease, microorganisms, right? So epizootics are contagious, and disease can jump from animals to humans. And so the focus is now more on slaughterhouse architecture, the walls, and how to conduct inspection of meat. So, and finally, concluding, I also in the story try to bring out the character of British imperialism by highlighting the ambivalence in the entire story. I argue that the Bengali middle class played a very crucial, singular role in this entire debate, because in many ways, Calcutta presented a contrast to maybe Delhi or cities like Madras or Bombay, because Western style education was introduced in Calcutta for the longest period, and so Bengalis were really deeply, probably the most deeply indoctrinated in Western sciences. So against this background, they were actively imbibing Western traditions and were not a mere local voice. And we notice this interesting sort of a hybridization. On one hand, they cling to their Vedas and Shastras, and on the other hand, they draw from the London Vegetarian Society and talk about human dental structure that's not meant for meat consumption. So one moment they're talking about demons, and the other moment they're talking about the dental structure. So it's a fascinating world of myths and fantastical tales and signs that take over their world. So they are a simultaneous figure of assimilation and discontent, of privilege and subordination. And I guess yes, that I argue that this is the way in which probably theoretically also we can sort of escape the binary of hegemony and appropriation, to show that they were grappling with this tension, this sort of dilemma in their world, as they fashioned a new kind of medical modernity. So I think I'm gonna end here. Eva, are we good on time? All right. So yeah, so that's what I intend to. I mean, that's what I do in my book, and this talk and sort of showing how they fashioned a new medical modernity, and that it's really it's possible to write entangled or braided and embodied histories of humans and animals. So yeah. All right. Thank you.